30 books, 30 years. One man, no credentials. This is 30 by 30 on Bert's Books.
Individualism is a calm and considered feeling which disposes each American citizen to isolate himself from the mass of his fellow citizens and withdraw into the circle of family and friends. With this little society formed to his taste, he gladly leaves the greater society to look after itself. As this tendency grows, there are more and more people who, though neither rich nor powerful enough to have much hold over others, have gained or kept enough wealth and enough understanding to look after their own needs. Such folk owe no man anything and hardly expect anything from anybody. They form the habit of thinking of themselves in isolation and imagine that their whole destiny is in their hands. Each man is forever thrown back on himself, alone, and there is danger that he may be shut up in the solitude of his own heart. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Brett Bateman Lindsley, and you are listening to the 30 by 30 book review podcast brought to you by www.bertreadsbooks.com. Remember, you can access the show on several platforms: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever is convenient for you. Okay, last time we were together, we started a new series by looking at how over the last 50 years, Americans have increasingly withdrawn into these private circles of self-interest. We talked about the decline of common projects and commitments that connect us in bonds of trust with our neighbors and fellow citizens. Well, that opening reading you heard shows that this problem goes back farther than we might think. The passage was written by French sociologist Alexis de Tocqueville in 1831 as he was reflecting on his travels in America, where he was studying our representative democratic governance and how our civil society, really healthy at that time, was functioning. De Tocqueville was interested in our daily habits, but he was also interested in something more abstract, what he called habits of the heart. Basically, these were the ways that Americans view and interpret the world around us. In the English translation of that book, we actually find for the first time the use of the English word individualism. And this was basically the specific worldview that de Tocqueville believed provided both the background of American citizens' best features, but also kind of the most imminent threat to our nation's future. Now, today we're looking at a book written in 1985 with the title Habits of the Heart, Individualism, and Commitment in American Life. It's a sociological study of public and private life in America today, but it's also a reflection on America's past. The author, Robert Bellah, and his team of researchers interviewed hundreds of Americans about their views on morality, society, politics, romance, and even God. Now, with the help of the historians on his team of researchers, Bellah was able to patch together how our views today in America relate to American views in the past, and he was able to find what de Tocqueville's studies never really could. Mainly, how this strange thing called individualism played out over the course of 200 years of American history. Today on 30 by 30, this is the first of two episodes on Habits of the Heart by Robert Bellah.
We have a very ambivalent relationship to governmental power, and especially to the notion of human freedom, which is sort of the big idea in American politics. Yes. Are we to be free from government or free for government? as faithful citizens in this country.
Right. Well, I think you could even generalize that as to whether freedom is freedom from or freedom for. Yeah. And certainly in our Christian heritage and in the colonial period, when the church was a very significant voice in public life, particularly in New England, freedom was understood as freedom for.
Yes.
What it was freedom from was sin and corruption, in order that we should do the right thing. The notion that freedom meant freedom from all restraint, to just everybody does whatever they want, was the last thing they thought freedom meant. So freedom, which is a word that trips from our tongues so easily as Americans, is one of the most ambivalent, ambiguous, complicated things in the world. And it cuts down very much on this question: are we free to do the right thing? Yeah. Are we free from those things that almost force us to do the wrong thing?
Almost.
That was the voice of Robert Bellah himself, reflecting on a few of the key themes in this book. Bellah is now deceased, but he was immensely influential in a variety of academic fields during his tenure as a professor of religious sociology at UC Berkeley. This book, Habits of the Heart, is his most popular book, and it was written for the general public. It was received with great acclaim when it came out, and it has really experienced kind of periods of renewed interest over the 35 years since it was published. The aim of the book, in Bellah's words, is to study, quote, how private and public life work in the United States, the extent to which private life either prepares people to take part in the public world or encourages them to find meaning exclusively in the private sphere, end quote. Like I said in the intro, this is both a sociological study and a historical survey. And Bellah himself often admitted that this makes it a hard book to summarize in, a short review. So for our purposes, I'm going to be dividing the book up into 2 episodes. And on today's episode, we are only going to walk through some of the history that Bellah presents in this book, because I think it is really an important backdrop for understanding Bellah's findings in his research, interviewing Americans about their public and private lives. Okay, now Bellah and his team of researchers interview hundreds of mostly middle-class Americans because when they're writing this book, economic inequality wasn't quite so pronounced as it is today, so the middle class was really pretty representative at that time of American beliefs and opinions as a whole. So at the beginning of the book, they introduce us to 5 individuals who they really think consolidate and encapsulate the trends that they find in American thinking. We meet a successful entrepreneur who once neglected his family but now values it. We meet a small-town blue-collar family man who tries to hold his small community's traditions together. We meet a beautiful female psychotherapist who's trying to help people find some meaning in life. And finally, we meet a Vietnam vet turned social justice advocate. So Bellah opens with these sketches of individuals because despite their differences in religion, socioeconomic status, political views, each of them shares some foundational beliefs that display the nature of individualism in America, our habits of the heart, right? Mainly, none of these characters feel confident enough to say what specifically human beings should want or be in life. They don't feel confident talking about any duty that all human beings should be pursuing. Though they do share some pretty clear convictions about the methods that you should use to achieve what you want in life. So there's a general ambivalence about life's purposes. And in this ambivalence, Bellah finds three key themes that concern the Americans he interviews. And these themes are freedom, success, and justice. Freedom, success, and justice. Now, Bellah is interested in the way Americans define these themes because he knows that the definitions seem at the same time both drastically different from the way they would have been understood at the time of our nation's founding, but in a strange way, they also seem contiguous or similar with our nation's historical definitions of those terms. So they're both the same and different. So before we get into some of the history, let me just give you a sense of how the Americans that Bellah interviews define these words. Let's start with freedom. Bellah says, quote, "Freedom turns out to mean being left alone by others, not having other people's values, ideas, or styles of life forced upon one. Being free of arbitrary authority in work, family, and political life. What it is that one might do with that freedom is much more difficult for Americans to define," end quote. Now, you've heard a lot about that on my podcast. Freedom for Americans is a matter of having as many choices available to them as possible. What freedom is not for Americans is the ability to pursue some conception of the common good. Now, the theme of success is closely related to that strange definition of freedom. Bellah says this, quote, "Americans tend to think of the ultimate goals of a good life as matters of personal choice. The means to achieve individual choice depends on economic progress," end quote. Now, around the world, America has a reputation for being a consumer society. We know this. The idea here is that the free market in a way reflects the way Americans value having a wide array of options in life more generally. So you have the cereal aisle with 100 different brands of cereal, and it's a metaphor almost for the American definition of freedom. And not having money limits our range of consumer choices. You might not have enough money to buy that brand of cornflakes you like. This represents a constraint on our freedom to choose, right? So long story short, gaining money becomes a way of defining success because it's a way of expanding our realm or range of choices. Because we don't have any shared conception of what freedom should be used for, the ability to make unencumbered financial choices is kind of the best evidence we have that we are leading a successful life. So that's success. So understanding the way these Americans think about freedom and success, Bellah explains how these Americans very strangely think about justice. Quote, "Our American traditions encourage us to think of justice as a matter of equal opportunities for every individual to pursue whatever he or she understands by happiness," end quote. So there it is again. The theme is unrestrained choice, whatever the individual understands happiness to mean. But what you'll notice here is that our definition of justice has no way of arbitrating between these different views of happiness, these different desires that people have. So let's use an extreme example here and say that you have a person for who killing puppies is what makes them happy. And this definition of justice really doesn't give you any way of saying that killing puppies is in any way morally wrong or unjust. At best, it just tells us that we have to make sure that the puppy killer has the opportunity to pursue his or her bliss in killing puppies, because it's their choice to do so. So just like our views on freedom and success, our view of justice is defined by a real ambivalence. It's difficult to pin down because it is so based on the individual's arbitrary choice. Now, Bellah will return to these ideas later, but first he's going to give us this fascinating history of American culture and how we come to view the world with these definitions. And the way he's going to do that is to walk us through 3 traditions of American life that go all the way back to our nation's foundations. Remember, I said that we're both different and similar to the founding generations in what we believe. So we're going to track these traditions back to the founding. And 2 of these traditions you'll be familiar with because they are associated with some people that we've talked about quite a bit on this podcast. First, the Puritans, who represent our kind of unique, austere religious heritage. You also have the Founding Fathers, who represent the intellectual ideals of the Enlightenment. And those are the ideas that really form the backbone for our forms of Republican governance. So these 2 groups are the source of what Bellah calls respectively the biblical tradition associated with the Puritans and the Republican tradition associated with the founders. And just to be clear here, abundantly clear, when we use the word Republican, we are not referring to the GOP or a political party. Republicanism, before it became a political party, was a word that represented our representative forms of democracy. That's republicanism. Okay, so important for both of these traditions is the idea that freedom is something that one protects for a certain purpose. For the most influential Puritans, these were people like John Winthrop, Cotton Mather, people like that who you've heard of, freedom was the ability to act in accordance with certain moral precepts. In the Puritan case, these were, of course, moral principles derived from religious rules and regulations. So no surprise here that our view of freedom is very different than that Puritan one. But what about our more secular traditions? Do we have something in common with those? Well, it turns out that the Founding Fathers actually shared a similar conception of freedom with the Puritans, albeit one that was rooted in the secular values of the Enlightenment. You see, for them, freedom existed so that people could participate in the life of the city. Remember that the founders were Enlightenment men, and the ancient intellectual traditions of Greece and Rome were a very important part of what our founding fathers were trying to revive. Freedom for the ancient republican and democratic traditions in Greece and Rome placed an expectation or constraint on you in the form of civic responsibility. Freedom meant showing up to assemblies and doing your duty. Now, if you remember our episode last week about Robert Putnam, this is precisely what Americans are not doing anymore. We are not showing up. We are not living up to duties of participation in the civic sphere. At any rate, Thomas Jefferson, for example, did not think freedom could work just anywhere, even though he was the most radical supporter at that time of democracy. Political equality, he understood, is something that you can't just expect to happen. Equality can only function in a society where people participate and take the responsibility of freedom very seriously. So again, even the historically secular, non-religious conception of ideas like freedom, justice, and success were very different in our views today. Bellah succinctly describes the difference between those biblical and republican traditions of freedom and our own. Quote, The notion of a formal freedom that would simply allow people to do whatever they pleased, for example, solely to make money, was as unpalatable to Thomas Jefferson as it would have been to John Winthrop. However important formal freedom was to either of them, freedom only took on its real meaning in a certain kind of society with a certain form of life, end quote. Again, the idea here is that because freedom comes with responsibilities, it naturally creates certain constraints on our realm of choices in life. Now, emerging alongside the biblical and Republican tradition was a third tradition, and it's the one that Alexis de Tocqueville noticed, what we might call the individualistic tradition. It's that sense of rustic self-reliance, self-assurance, and self-expression that are elements of the American people that people around the world recognize in our most famous and admired historical figures. Now, Bellah really helpfully points out that the individualistic tradition has tended to exist in kind of two unique forms that over time have become more separate and more identifiable. He calls these expressive individualism and utilitarian individualism. So Bellah uses Benjamin Franklin, as portrayed in his autobiography, as the best kind of example of that utilitarian version of individualism. Utilitarian individualism is all about organizing your life into something orderly to achieve your individual desires. The sociologist Max Weber also famously used Benjamin Franklin to describe the so-called spirit of capitalism. The word Weber used to describe Franklin's mindset was rationalism, and I think that captures the idea of utilitarian individualism pretty well. Because Benjamin Franklin is this guy who is always trying to organize his life into these orderly systems that are aimed at productivity. So, for example, in his autobiography, Franklin takes this ancient idea of the virtues, right? Very Enlightenment idea that's being taken from ancient Greece. And those were traditionally understood as these moral characteristics, but what he does is he turns them into tools that can be used for personal success in financial and social pursuits. Now, we already mentioned how founders like Thomas Jefferson understood that freedom must be used to create a certain kind of citizen and a certain kind of society. And it's important to note that with Franklin, he understands that, and he, in a way, views these utilitarian skills as a way to create an independent, self-sufficient citizen. So even though it is self-interested, it's self-interested in an enlightened kind of way because it's aimed at making you a competent citizen who can serve the society. But as we'll see, these ideas about rational order in our personal lives catch on in America in a way that people begin using them purely for private gain and in selfish ways. So that's the tradition of utilitarian individualism. Now there's also this tradition of expressive individualism. This is embodied by Americans like the poet Walt Whitman, who is known for writing about his, sexuality in this kind of open and transgressive way. And obviously that's something that we value in American life, being expressive. You also have essayists like Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson who write about going into nature to find one's true self, independent of society's influence, this kind of pure natural self that can express itself. So in this version of individualism, success in life is defined by intense feeling in which our emotions about others and the universe are seen as this kind of ultimate truth that the successful person finds and that they are proud and unapologetic to express in public. Bellah quotes this very revealing and beautiful passage from Walt Whitman's poem Passage to India, where the poet talks about his own feelings this way, quote, "O soul, restless, I with thee and thou with me, thy circumnavigation of the world begin, of man, the voyage of his mind's return, to reason's early paradise, back to wisdom's birth, to innocent intuitions, again with fair creation," end quote. Or in another different poem by Walt Whitman, quote, "Afoot and light-hearted I take to the open road, healthy, free, the world before me, the long path before me, leading wherever I choose," end quote. So this expressive tradition is very much about finding what is unique about yourself, about what you are beneath all the pressures and definitions that society places on you, and making choices based on that pure, untampered version of yourself. So again, you have the biblical and Republican traditions that emphasized freedom for a certain specific way of life, and then you have the two kinds of individualism. Now, remember, I told you that Alexis de Tocqueville was the person who coined this term individualism. And the reason is that he was trying to explain to the world the unique way in which Americans use a pursuit of their own self-interest as a means to better their democratic institutions. And de Tocqueville was just a genius at thinking through how this worked and how he thought it might play out. He says this in his book, Democracy in America. Quote, "The Americans are fond of explaining almost all the actions of their lives by the principle of self-interest rightly understood. They show with complacency how an enlightened regard for themselves constantly prompts them to assist each other and inclines them willingly to sacrifice a portion of their time and property to the welfare of the state," end quote. So just as an example, today we might think about something like our education as a way of getting employment credentials or figuring out what we want to personally be in life. But for the founding generations, education was conceived as self-improvement that would prepare one for participation in civil institutions. Again, using Benjamin Franklin or Thomas Jefferson as examples, these were persons who were incredibly self-sufficient in a way that was foreign to Alexis de Tocqueville as a Frenchman. But he recognized that for all this time that Americans spent tending to their own personal matters, they did so to prepare their bodies and intellects to be in tip-top shape for activities that were intended to sustain the broader civil society. So even individualism in its earlier forms, like the Republican and biblical traditions, was something that was conceived and believed to be commensurate with certain purposes, right? Certain shared purposes in the society. So all of these people we've talked about kind of embody this early American ideal of the independent, self-sufficient farmer citizen who was educated to participate in civic life. Now, obviously, we must admit there was a good deal of fantasy in this ideal, as even Thomas Jefferson openly admitted chattel slavery, our country's original sin, played an important role in upholding the viability of this American ideal character. It's questionable whether it could have existed without this horrendous sin of slavery. But that said, just for our purposes in this review, what Bellah wants us to notice is that even without considering, the detrimental effects of slavery or what role slavery played in upholding our ideals, there are certain inherent tensions in the traditions that we've talked about. And that's what de Tocqueville was talking about in that opening clip we heard. Remember, he coined this term individualism to capture both what he admired and what he feared about American self-sufficiency, expressiveness, and self-interest. These characteristics were conducive to democratic citizenship, but within them was also the inherent danger of threatening our common lives together by causing people to look exclusively inwards, to view self-interest as an end in itself and not as a means to citizenship. Now, when we come back from a short break, we will look at the way these inherent dangers have played out and changed our conceptions of the ideal American throughout our nation's history. We'll be right back. Hello, friends. I don't need to tell you that civil discourse has seemed to reach an impasse in this country. This show is my earnest, if often messy, contribution to overcoming that impasse. If you want to be part of that project, the most important thing you can do is to get a cup of coffee with a friend and talk about the important kinds of ideas discussed in these books. If we aren't putting options on the table, nothing will change. But you can also help by letting me know that you're listening. Subscribe on your favorite podcast service or on YouTube. Leaving a review or rating on Apple Podcasts is also a great way to help others find my show. I also welcome your generosity. You'll find a link to my Amazon book wish list in the description of today's episode. Send me a book and I'll make sure to give you a shout out when I review it. Last but not least, I welcome your direct participation in the show. Head over to www.bertreadsbooks.com and you'll find my contact information if you've written something you think I should review or you'd like to host an episode of the show on a book I've missed. As always, I couldn't do this show without you. Thanks, and I hope you enjoy the rest of today's show. Welcome back to the show. So, Bellah is going to talk about something called representative character types in American history. And this is one of my absolute favorite concepts, and actually several of my favorite authors use it. People like Alistair McIntyre and Philip Reif. So I hope you enjoy thinking about this idea. So, Bellah describes the idea of representative character types this way. Quote, "A representative character provides an ideal, a point of reference and focus that gives living expressions to a vision of life. As in our society today, sports figures might legitimate the strivings of youth, or the scientist represents objective competence," end quote. So a representative character is an imaginary person, like the scientist or the athlete, who captures the most ideal vision of our society's values. Now, Bellah says that for the founding generations of our nation, the ideal character was that of the independent farmer citizen. This was the self-sufficient small landowner that we talked about earlier. So Bellah describes the noble ideals that character represented to our ancestors. Quote, "The town and the independent citizen had provided a metaphor of a moral ecology in which the polarities of public and private, masculine and feminine, utilitarian and expressive, were integrated by means of generally shared codes of behavior. Pre-industrial American character surely oscillated between the instrumental, utilitarian orientation of the masculine world of work achievement and the expressive values of the feminine spheres of nurturing domesticity. I can't say that word. But the pre-industrial cultural framework made that oscillation, including its conflicts, intelligible." End quote. So Bellah talks about this ecology or an environment, the small town of farmers and artisans who go to the town hall or the parish church. And he's noting that that environment is able to balance these polarities or contradictions, if you will, that existed between the biblical, Republican, and individualist traditions, these contradictions that de Tocqueville noticed. Now, last week, I closed the episode with a quote from Robert Putnam in which he used a similar ecological metaphor, saying that democracy and its institutions are a bit like a plant reacting to climate change. He said that if the abundant resources of social capital were to decline, our institutions would necessarily have to change. They wouldn't work well in a different kind of environment. Well, in American history, Robert Bellah sees something like that happening in our so-called habits of the heart, in that the evolving society of the United States starts to change the representative character of our ideals. Specifically, he's going to note the influence of industry and the market economy as it eclipses and replaces the Jeffersonian agrarian ideal. Now, just as a sidebar here, and you've probably picked this up already, that Bellah's work has something like a conservative flavor to it in its respect and interest in tradition. But I think it's worth noting here, just for your edification, that as a student at Harvard, Bellah was a genuine card-carrying communist who was censored and witnessed the famous blacklisting during the McCarthy era. So it's just interesting to me to see how that era made him a really avid defender of our traditions of free speech and free inquiry and our civil institutions. But at the same time, as it made him kind of traditionalist and conservative in that way, it didn't deter him from being critical of unmitigated industrialism and capitalism in a way that is, somewhat sympathetic to Karl Marx's most incisive observations about things like alienation, right? So you'll notice and appreciate his unique blend of traditionalism and leftist critique. So that's just a sidebar. At any rate, Bellah sees how the changing economic environment starts to affect our ideal American character. With the emergence of industry and large cities, the self-reliant farmer of the Benjamin Franklin or Henry David Thoreau type goes through this subtle change into a character that Bellah calls the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur. So where Jefferson and Washington are these mythological heroes that represent independent citizens, you now have the titans of industry like John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, who represent the industrial self-made citizen. Now, if you have time to read it, you should check out an article called Opportunity in the Promised Land by Christopher Lasch that talks in detail about this change, and it does so specifically with the Civil War era in mind. Remember, the Civil War is indeed about slavery, but it's also about whether westward expansion will be agrarian or industrial in nature. Are we going to be a country of farmers or industrialists? Now, Abraham Lincoln, you may recall, is a character very preoccupied with this kind of glorious, almost futuristic utopian vision of an industrial America. And what Lasch does in that article is help us to see how part of Lincoln's genius was to take the early American utopian visions of the Puritans and the founders, and he translates that from a farm setting to an industrial one. So you kind of get this vision of progress becoming a general American value that is removed from its original vision. And this entrepreneur character type represents that. He is the ambivalent utopian with no end in mind. The hero is now someone who progresses, but without the constraints of an ultimate purpose. The idea of social mobility is invented at this time, right? That basically the main idea is just that you're moving, that you're progressing, but not necessarily towards something. And Bellah says that it is this ideal character that ends up legitimizing the new industrial America and creates the ideal middle class of people raised from poverty but looking towards riches. And remember how ambivalent our definitions of freedom, success, and justice are. with this new figure of the entrepreneur in the industrial age, you start to get a sense of how our ambivalence is developing. Now, as these changes take place, remember that we are working with an American society where the different spheres of life are pretty organically connected, so that changes in the economic order of society are naturally going to affect family life and political life as well. In a sense, it's only as these changes in the economy take place that we are even able to imagine that our work lives, our home lives, our political lives are separate spheres at all. If you're reading writers from pre-industrial America, this kind of separation and segmentation that we have in life today doesn't seem quite as pronounced. But obviously, when you have an hourly wage labor that's happening on someone else's watch and on someone else's property, there is an obvious line of demarcation between your work life and your home life. Now, even for artisans who might have left home to go to the shop in pre-industrial America, this new way of life is distinctly different because, as Karl Marx points out, industrial labor is producing products that go to God knows where, right? They aren't products that you personally use or that you trade with your neighbor for his farm foods. And so this new organizational style of the corporation is purely utilitarian in nature. Our work lives are separate and they are all about rational organization. Remember, we talked about Benjamin Franklin's utilitarianism. But much like the idea of progress being cut off from the agrarian notion of progress for the sake of citizenship, utilitarian efficiency now becomes an end in itself and not something that is used to cultivate civic virtue like it was for Benjamin Franklin. So it's in this environment that we get this new representative character that Bellah calls simply the manager. This is basically the person who is able to maximize utility and efficiency and to organize life into a bureaucracy, essentially. Now, as I said, this represents economic life being ripped off and separated from the organic ecology that was once represented by the independent farmer. And with the rise of wage labor and bureaucratic organizations, you have an exclusively utilitarian sphere of life where only efficiency matters. And in turn, the home comes to be viewed as a separate place. And it's viewed differently now because it's viewed as a kind of haven from the heartless world of the corporation. Bellah points out that it's in this time period that those two forms of individualism we talked about, the expressive and the utilitarian, really become identifiably separate because they are institutionalized in American life, right? The home represents your sensitive, expressive self, where you have take haven from a heartless world, but your business is the heartless world of utility and efficiency. Now, in one sense, the manager representative character seems uniquely capable of dealing with this fragmentation of life. He is the person who can diplomatically harmonize the different spheres of life and try to bring their different interests into a unified whole. He can master the impersonal calculating skills of the market while keeping the personal caring skills of the home intact. But, as we know, this kind of management of separate spheres only goes so far, and it has not been horribly successful in American life. Sure, the manager can maximize the utility of his labor as a means to buy luxuries that make his home life more comfortable. But in a way that makes the divide between work and home life all the more severe, and it is increasingly difficult to manage these starkly different skill sets that dominate private life and your public life as an employee. So, as we move into our modern age, our today, we find the emergence of a final representative character type who replaces the manager. This is the person who, in a way, teaches people, including the manager, to accept the fragmented world as it is, instead of trying to harmonize it. This is the therapist. Now, allow me to read some words from Bellah here. Quote, "Like the manager, the therapist is a specialist in mobilizing resources for effective action. Only here, the resources are largely internal to the individual, and the measure of effectiveness is the elusive criterion of personal satisfaction. Like the manager, the therapist takes the functional organization of industrial society for granted. While the culture of the manager and the therapist does not speak in the language of traditional moralities, it nonetheless proffers a normative order of life, with character ideals, images of the good life, and methods of attaining it. Yet it is an understanding of life generally hostile to older ideals of moral order. Its center is the autonomous individual, presumed able to choose the roles he will play and the commitments he will make, not on the basis of higher truths, but according to the criterion of life effectiveness as the individual judges it." End quote. Now, just to be clear here, Bellah is not throwing the practice of psychology under the bus. Just like you use the scientists to represent objective competence, Bellah is here using the therapist as an ideal character who represents the way in which we deal with our disjointed habits of the heart. Indeed, as Bellah points out, the very word therapist suggests the need for a cure. But this raises the question, a cure for what? And the answer is that we realize that these disjointed spheres of life, the private and the public, have ceased to have any meaningful connection. And the therapist helps us to identify our arbitrary desires and indeed to justify our expression of them in this world that makes no sense. So I just want to paint a picture for you of our culture through the lens of the traditions and representative characters that we've outlined. Notice specifically how expressive and utilitarian individualism are traditions that are clearly still with us, but that they have taken on a drastically different meaning than they once had. We believe in the freedom of individuals to express their arbitrary preferences without constraint. One of the things that constrains our preferences is anything that would give us a way to arbitrate between our competing preferences. So what happens is that the old Benjamin Franklin utilitarianism starts to be used in a kind of cold, manipulative, bureaucratic way. Now, obviously, this hasn't prevented the biblical tradition and the Republican traditions from being things that we at least vocally claim to care about. People loudly say these are important to them. But notice that the Republican and biblical traditions have undergone a drastic change in their meaning as well. Religion and Republican democracy were once ideals that provided us with norms and purposes to arbitrate between us as individuals. Remember, we said that freedom in those traditions meant freedom for something. But with our new understanding of freedom from constraint, our religious and democratic traditions become just two more preferences. And it's merely by chance that a lot of individual Americans just happen to prefer Republican democracy or they prefer religion. When we actually examine those traditions closely, we find there's no way we have in the current situation to justify thinking that other people should also value democracy or religion, right? Because everything is so based on our arbitrary choices and preferences, we cannot say that democracy or religion are objectively good things. We can't expect other people to want them in the current situation. Bellah says this, quote, "The new culture is deeply ambiguous. It represents both the easing of constraints and of dogmatic prejudices about what others should be, as well as an idealization of the coolly manipulative style of management. In our society, with its sharply divided spheres, it provides a way for the beleaguered individual to develop techniques for coping with the often contradictory pressures of public and private life. Yet it does so by extending the calculating managerial style into intimacy, home, and community, areas of life that were formerly governed by the norms of a moral ecology." So as we close this first section of the book, what we've seen is how early American life was a collection of these different traditions that were brought together under certain specific conditions to create a kind of organic vision of life and purpose for us as an American people. But as the country changed, even as it changed for the better in so many ways, and produced characters like Martin Luther King Jr., who transcended the more negative aspects of these changes, the individual pieces of a holistic, if often flawed tradition were slowly and silently separated from this vision of life that gave them logic and meaning. And so today, we only find these traditions existing in kind of mangled forms. The representative characters of our American life, the manager and the therapist, represent coldness and manipulativeness as markers of the way we live together. So on the next episode of 30 by 30, we will follow Bellah as he studies individual Americans and finds out the specific habits and ways of speaking that characterize this new way of life. Now, before we close, I want to remind you that de Tocqueville foresaw many of these changes. They were habits of the heart in the young republic that he thought could be twisted either by tyrants or by our own lack of care into something very dark, very manipulative. Nevertheless, he often depicted our young nation as a beacon of hope in the world. He had a deep admiration for so many characteristics of American life, even as he knew those same characteristics would simultaneously always be threats. So, you know this, there's no golden age for us to go back to, especially as we are kind of disenchanted of these old notions we used to have about how perfect American life was, as more information comes out to us about what, say, slavery really entailed and what Jim Crow really entailed. So there's no golden age to go back to. There's no glorious Eden that existed on these shores, but there are these historical characteristics that we should study, sometimes to correct indeed, but just as often, I think, to imitate. And that's a messy project, sometimes a dark, scary one, but ultimately a hopeful one too. And that's probably a good view for democratic citizenship in general. Citizenship's demands are not sentimental. If citizenship were easy, it wouldn't have to be wiped off the face of the earth for 2,000 years after the fall of the Greek republics, right? It requires a constantly renewed commitment to self-reflection and perseverance. And this show is really my attempt at renewing my own commitment to that cause, to self-reflection. And I hope it is helpful to you as well. In fact, if you like this episode or any other episode, I recommend that you send one to a friend and carve out some time to talk about the themes over a cup of coffee. I think that will be really important as we try to salvage, if you were. I hate to use that word, but salvage what is good about American life and renew our commitments to each other, even as we have to change our ways of life as well. To that end, a listener requested that I start including some discussion questions that bring the topics of these books into a more practical register, a register that helps us navigate American citizenship in the age of Black Lives Matter and Make America Great Again. So you'll find some questions in the description of today's episode. And I'm going back and slowly adding questions to my other videos as well, so make sure you check those out. But hope you enjoyed today's episode. Remember to come back next week. You'll want to listen to this episode before you get to that episode, and we will look forward to seeing how these traditions play out today in American life. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.